Hello, I'm Ellen Hanak. I'm an economist with the Public Policy Institute of California, which is a nonpartisan research organization that works on important public policy issues for the state. And my specialty is water policy. And in particular today, I want to talk to you about some research that we've done that looks at a very important drought management tool, and that is water marketing and a related practice known as groundwater banking. So I'm going to be talking to you largely based on a study that we did that came out in November 2012, which takes us up to the 2011 water year. It's really too soon in this drought to know exactly how things are playing out, but I can give us some picture based on how the trends have been in the past, and also at the end I'll talk to you a little bit about what we're starting to see in this critical dry year. So, outline of my talk, I'm going to first give you a little bit of background. What is water marketing and what is groundwater banking? And a little bit about the conditions that are necessary to have in place in order for that to work well. Then I'm going to talk to you a bit about water market trends in California, then a bit about groundwater banking trends, and then finally a little wrap up with some implications for policy. So first, what are these tools and why do they matter? Water marketing refers to the temporary, long-term, or permanent trades of the rights to use water. And groundwater banking refers to the storage of surface water in aquifers, so underground, in wet years, so that it's available for use in dry years. And in particular, with groundwater banking, we often think of that as something that involves banking and storing for folks not only who are using that particular aquifer, but also it can be done for people that are off-site. So you might be able to bank your water in a county far away from you if you have a deal with the groundwater bank manager. Now, why do these tools matter for California? Well, we're talking about this now in the context of this very severe drought that California is facing, because these tools can reduce the cost of drought. What they enable you to do, so a water market enables some people who have water use rights for activities that they're able to cut back on, or maybe they have some extra water in storage that they're able to make available. They can make that available in exchange for financial compensation for folks who have activities that would be much more costly to scale back on during a drought. So the kinds of things you see are transfers between farmers who are growing annual crops like rice or cotton or corn to farmers that have tree crops in place that it would be much more costly to not water because those trees could die. Whereas the compensation there, or the deal, would involve making sure that the farmers, if they're scaling back on their rice or their cotton or their corn, will get enough money for not only covering their water costs, but also any profits that they would have made from the growing of those crops and the use of the water in that activity. You also see transfers to urban areas in order so that cities and suburbs don't have to scale back on important activities during a drought, and sometimes also transfers for the support of fish and wildlife, so environmental transfers. Now, in addition to accommodating or helping to reduce the cost of drought, this can help accommodate shifts in demand over the long term if you're getting changes in the geographic scale of economic activity. If you're getting, for example, we're having long-term shifts in demand for water in some places because of the rise of tree crops. You'd see some long-term shifts in demand there, as well as for population growth. You also see this as useful in the longer term in adapting to a changing climate, where we're expecting that we're going to be having more irregular, more frequent droughts, probably combined with more frequent flooding or more severe flooding, and the market can kind of help smooth that out with this compensation mechanism. Groundwater banking works in a similar kind of way. It's especially useful for thinking about storing for droughts, because you're storing in wet years in order to have it available for dry years. But it's also useful as thinking about a part of a long-term tool for those folks who need more reliable water supplies to have it there in those times. Now, thinking about how we do this, both marketing and banking have some requirements and some constraints. And a big requirement is infrastructure. You need to be able to connect the parties involved in a market transfer between the source and the destination. You need to be able to get the water from the seller to the buyer. And sometimes that can happen through a process of exchanges, so it doesn't have to be the exact drop, but you need to have the plumbing in place to be able to do that. And then for banking, you need to also be able to get, store, and retrieve the water from the banks. So that will sometimes require some additional investments in infrastructure to be able to get the water to special recharge areas in the place that has a groundwater bank, and also perhaps some additional pumps in order to be able to get the water out again, and that might involve some new conveyance facilities as well. That's on the sort of infrastructure side. On the protection side, sort of more the institutional and legal overlay for marketing banking, there are several rules that really have to apply for this to work well. The first is that you shouldn't be able to sell somebody else's water, and that includes water for fish and wildlife, for the environment. What that often gets referred to as is you shouldn't be able to have impacts on other water users. And California law is pretty good at protecting other water users, especially other users of surface water. There's something called the no injury protection, which ensures that. We're not as good on the groundwater side because we don't have a statewide law covering that. So as I'll show you in a minute, counties have kind of stepped in to provide some stopgap protections in that area. The second kind of protection is that, particularly applying to groundwater banking, you need to be able to protect the water in the bank accounts. So if I'm going to be storing water in a groundwater bank or in an aquifer somewhere, I need to be sure that I can get it out in the same way that if I put money in a financial bank, I need to be able to, I don't want to do that unless I'm going to know that it'll be there when I come to get it. And in groundwater banking, what that often means is that what that generally means is that you need a special set of management protocols and rules in order to do careful monitoring of who's putting water in, who's taking water out. Now this can work best in places that are fully what we call adjudicated, where the rights to use the water in a basin are all sort of parceled out and everybody knows exactly what shares they have. It's also working in some places that have kind of semi-formal rules, and we'll look at that a little bit later in the talk. Now the third protection relates to other folks that could be affected, and this is especially relevant for water marketing. If farmers, for example, are cutting back on their rice crops or their cotton or their corn in order to sell water, that might have some economic impacts on the local farm community for the folks who aren't able to sell as much in terms of inputs, for the folks who are not getting as much jobs in terms of the working on the fields, and also downstream, if that means that less is going to the processing plants and transportation and all of the sort of things that we think about as a crop sector. So there's often concern in the source communities about large-scale land fallowing for the water market because it can have these kinds of impacts, and transfers that involve a lot of fallowing often try to make sure that they're not having these kinds of negative economic impacts. With a groundwater bank, similar kind of thing, you want to make sure that you're not having negative impacts on other folks in the surrounding area by the way the banking is operating. You don't want to negatively impact their groundwater levels, which could mean more costly pumping for them. So on the infrastructure side of things, California is pretty unique among Western states in having a very extensive infrastructure network with a lot of conveyance facilities, a lot of above and below ground opportunities for storage that facilitates water marketing and groundwater banking. And this map that you see with all of the sort of squiggly colored lines and the little triangles, those lines are conveyance facilities. Some of them are natural. The blue ones are natural. That's the big blue one on the top is the Sacramento River, and the big blue one at the bottom right corner is the Colorado River. And then you see all the other colored ones. Those are man-made conveyance aqueducts or canals that we use to move water around. And those are all pretty much scaled to size. So you get a sense of, we've built a lot of conveyance infrastructure. The little triangles are different surface reservoirs that are used to store water. This infrastructure basically makes it possible to move water, to sell water from all the way up north at the top of the Sacramento River that you see up there, all the way down to San Diego. And that happens through a process of exchanges, and it comes down, and you lose some water over time through evaporation and so on, but basically it makes it possible to do quite a lot of marketing. And the map that you see on your left shows you all the counties that have been active in the market, or it's basically water users within those counties that have been active in the market. And almost all of that, with the exception of the folks at the very top north in dark blue, those have really been transfers that are not just within their county, but actually within those regions, and in some cases going across regions. We do have a critical weakness in our infrastructure for water marketing, and that is the delta. You can see that in that infrastructure map to the left, circled there in red, that's the region we're talking about, and then the map to your right, the colorful map to your right, is a sort of blow-up map showing you the delta. This is an area where we did not build conveyance. We sort of relied on pulling water from the Sacramento River through, you see the white arrows, the white broken arrows on the graph to your left. We basically pull the water through a series of man-made canals around man-made islands in this region down to pumps that are down at the southwest of the delta, and you can see that red circle there showing that. And what this was a decision that was made back when the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project were built, because it was viewed as basically less expensive than building an artificial canal to bring the water through. It was recognized that eventually it might make sense to do something differently. There have been a lot of discussions lately about possibly building some new man-made conveyance there in the form of tunnels going underneath the delta to get the water to the pumps. And one of the reasons that folks are looking at that is to have more possibility of reliable service in various kinds of water years, and to be able to avoid some of the negative environmental impacts of pumping the way we're doing it now. So this is a fragile hub in part because there are a lot of endangered species in this region, endangered fish species, and that makes it often very tricky in order to sort of get the timing of moving the water in ways that are not harmful for the fish and that are also useful for irrigators and urban users. And it's also the case that there is a lot of earthquake risk in this area. So over the longer term, there's concern about this system breaking down, because all of the areas that are not green in that picture, the yellow, the red, and the orange, those are areas that are below sea level. And so if an earthquake came and those islands were flooded, you would have salt water coming in from the ocean and from the bay, and that would force you to shut down the pumps as well. So in the near term, the big concerns are really related to the environmental constraints, which have limited the ability to use the delta, especially in dry years. Now, I mentioned about groundwater, the state not having a complete set of protections on that, and not protecting groundwater users well from people who might want to export that water to other places, because the law in California pretty much is that if you own land, you're able to draw groundwater out of it. And so people were concerned in the rural counties that this would lead to, sucking the aquifer dry and putting it in the canal and sending it down to LA. That was sort of the concern back when a lot of these ordinances started to get put into place, especially in the early 90s through the late 90s. And so what you've seen happen is that counties have put in place ordinances. These are counties that don't have a lot of groundwater regulation, but they were able to agree that they didn't want people to be able to export groundwater. And so this map shows you basically the landscape of that. There are some variations in the rules that are in place. So the dark blue counties also restrict groundwater banking with parties that are outside of the county. The orange ones are a little bit more lenient. As far as exports go, they might be restricted just to certain areas or certain kinds of activities. But in general, these restrictions require people to get a permit from the county in order to export groundwater, and sometimes in order to export surface water and pump groundwater instead, which is one way that people sometimes transfer water. Okay, now let's look at water market trends. And what I can show you here is data that we've collected over time, starting in the early 80s and going through 2011. And so here's the sort of big picture overview. For a second, don't worry about the colors in those bars. Just look first at the background shading. And I'll just show you here, these beige areas are all dry and critically dry periods. So you can see that during this period of several decades, we've had some droughts, and that's going to be instructive in thinking about the role of marketing during droughts. Now, the bars show you the total amount of water traded, and if you go all the way up to counting the yellow and the dark blue and the light blue, that's the amount of water that actually moved in any given year. The orange on top is some additional amounts that were potentially available but didn't actually change hands in those years under long-term and permanent sales. Now let's just to break down for you these colors a little bit more. The yellow bars, those are short-term transfers. That's a transfer agreement for a particular year. The dark blue is long-term transfers. Those are agreements that have a minimum of 2 years, but typically have much more. And usually you're talking about at least 10 or 12 years, and in some cases up to 75 years. And then the light blue, those are permanent transfers. Those are permanent sales of water rights or long-term contracts from one party to another. So once that's sold, it permanently goes in the hands of the other folks. So the orange is just, if you add up the long-term and permanent contracts, that's the amount that, the maximal amount that could have been transferred in those years. And in most cases, that hasn't happened yet, either because these deals are ramping up or because in some years you don't get the full amount of your contract. Now, if you look over the whole period of time, you can see that back in the early 80s, there wasn't much going on in the way of a water market in California, and that over time it definitely has picked up significantly. And look at the bottom part of the graph here. We've really broken it down for you into three big periods, three main periods. The first is from 87 to 94, and that is what we're calling the period of drought-related growth. You can see that we had a major drought in this period, starting in 1987, went through 1992, 93 was okay, and then 94 was dry again. That was really the period where the market got going, and you can see that, and the numbers went from almost negligible to over 1 million acre-feet in 1991. That was the year of the launch of the state's Drought Water Bank, which California is quite famous for around the world, actually. That was a way of avoiding serious rationing in 1991. And it got really very experimental. In a very short order of time, the Department of Water Resources put that together with water users. Then the second phase is environment-related growth. And so we're really marking here from 95 to 2002. I got to say that most of these years were not only not dry, they were pretty wet. So this was, you see, a period of significant growth over this time, even though we're looking at wet years. And a lot of that is related to changes in environmental regulations, which meant that some farmers had to buy water, make up water, because they'd lost some water through some new requirements on keeping water in stream. So they started buying water from other farmers especially. And then you also saw during this period the introduction of an environmental water market where the state and federal agencies were buying some water to support the environment. Finally, this last period, starting in 2003 and going up to 2011, calling the most recent period, so most recent period for which we have complete data, and this is really a combination of things happening. You can see that there hasn't been very much growth at all during this period, either in overall committed amounts or in actual transfers. So there's been an overall deceleration in the pace of the market since 2003. But you also see a big shift in these colors where yellow has become yellow, the short-term transfers are now in the minority, and you have much more moving through long-term and permanent transfers. So that's a sort of combined shift that really reflects some changes and arguably a maturation of the market, but also some new concerns. So just to kind of highlight for you again, long-term and permanent trades now dominate the market. This kind of breaks it down by these three phases. You can see that here it's the green, that's the short term. That's now a minority of the whole picture. Most of the long-term and permanent transactions have been purchases by cities, which now need to, under a 2001 law, need to show that they've got long-term water available to support new development. But we also do see some of the higher value farms, especially in the Sacramento Valley, in the San Joaquin Valley, purchasing long-term contracts in order to know that they have water available for their tree crops. And we also have the case of a few long-term environmental transfers where there's water purchased by state and or federal agencies over anywhere from an 8-year to a 12-year contract in order to provide in-stream flows for the environment. So the second piece of this most recent puzzle is that the market has been slowing. And so here I've just broken out for you just the 2003 to 2011 period, and you can see that it's really pretty flat. And what we see there when we break out the amount that's normally available even in wet years relative to some special dry year sales is that during the drought, we only made about 500,000, maybe 600,000 acre feet available in special dry year supplies between 2007 and 2010. And 2010 was kind of still considered, an end of the drought period. It was still officially part of the drought, even though the year was not officially dry. And this is despite the fact that the state was hoping to really mobilize a lot of water through the water market, especially in 2009. And what happened, why it was relatively disappointing compared to the projections and certainly compared to what happened in the early 90s was a combination of things. One was infrastructure constraints, where new pumping restrictions on the Delta made it much harder to get water through from the northern part of the state to the San Joaquin Valley and the urban areas in the Bay Area and Southern California. The second is institutional constraints, where it's become a lot more difficult, more complex to get your transfers approved than it used to be. When we started the Drought Water Bank in '91, that was put together in a matter of 6 weeks, and there were some mistakes made in the process that were sort of handled afterwards, and sort of people looked to mitigate the problems afterwards. And arguably at this point, we've become much more sort of risk averse to approving transfers during droughts than we were back in the early 90s. So this is really something that I think a lot of people looked at as a postmortem after 2009 and did a lot of thinking about what do we need to do differently in order to make this work better. So just as a sort of overall picture, I mentioned, I think, a lot of transfers were going from the Sacramento Valley. Here you can see it here. In the early period, this is the average of 1987 to 94. These are exports out of the Sacramento Valley toward other parts of the state. That's come way down. So in the 2003 to 11 period, on average, it's about a third as much as was going out during the early drought period. This was not as dry a period, but there was also a significant drought, so it suggests really that there's been a shift in the nature of the market. The San Joaquin Valley, which you normally think of as a net importer, and that was certainly the case in the first phase that we're looking at, and in the second as well, has become a net exporter of water. This is especially long-term and permanent sales of agricultural water contracts to urban areas in Southern California. Southern California has continued to be a net importer, much bigger now, and that's really to support urban growth. Bay Area, relatively smaller player on the market, but also somewhat of a net importer. We've also seen that a lot more activity is happening within counties and within regions as the market has grown. Now overall, we're moving about 1.5 million acre feet a year, and there are commitments to transfer up to 2 million. Just to keep that in mind, what that means in terms of the overall water use in California, anywhere between 3 to 5% in a given year. Environmental water purchases, I mentioned, became something important, especially in that middle period between the 95 and 2002. And this breaks down environmental purposes, water purposes into their different categories, and it shows you the total volumes transferred. And you can see that, it was really pretty significant. So in this middle period, we were looking at, 450, almost 500,000 acre-feet of environmental water being purchased, and that's a combination of water going to wildlife refuges, so that's the orange, in extra flows, especially for some experimental in-stream flow tests in the San Joaquin River area and east side rivers. This dark green is delta flows, something called the environmental water account, which was designed to basically kind of help manage environmental flows while making water still available for other users. And then these smaller categories are some environmental transfers in some localized regions, including down in the Salton Sea, down in the Imperial Valley, as well as just in various other river basins, North Coast, Central Coast. Now, we think that environmental water purchases are a useful complement to environmental regulation because they can help lessen conflicts and they can also raise the efficiency of environmental water management, but you need a funding source for this. And the cash is running out, which is really a big explanation for why you see the volumes declining here, so that we're back down to about half of the maximum values from the 90s. And really, a lot of this money has been coming just from taxpayer dollars and from state bonds in particular. So over about half was from state bonds. About a quarter of this money is coming from water users, from a surcharge on water use in some specific projects. Okay, groundwater banking trends. Just a little bit of an overview. And I should say that we can't look at all groundwater banking in the state because there's not really a good record keeping of this. So what we looked at was some particular kinds. And if you could think about groundwater management and storage, there are really three ways that this gets done in California. There are very formal systems where you have adjudicated basins or special management districts that have special legislative authority, and they have authority to monitor, to account for pumping and recharge, and to charge money for that as well. You see that especially in Southern California and Silicon Valley, in urbanized areas where the problems have become so acute that people basically needed a management solution. Then you have informal management, and that's really most of the rest of the state, where you've got voluntary management and where you sometimes have irrigation districts that use price incentives to encourage people to pump surface water, to use surface water and not pump groundwater in wet years, and that allows the groundwater basin to recharge. But they don't really account for this in a very formal way, so it's kind of just for the overlying users. Then you've got a third type, which we call semi-formal, and that is where you've got accounting for people that are parties to a groundwater bank, but not for other local pumpers. And you see this especially in Kern County. And so the focus of our study was looking at banking that exists where you have off-site parties that are storing their water, and this is especially in Kern and in Southern California. So let's look at what's been happening. First, show you the sort of where things are. This map shows you formal systems. So as you can see, mainly in the urbanized areas, especially in Southern California, the red are the adjudicated basins, and the yellow are these special groundwater management districts like in Orange County and in the Coachella Valley and in Silicon Valley. The blue just shows you all of the places where we have groundwater in California, which is a lot. And then this shows you a blow-up of Kern County, and these in particular, the colored areas are within the valley floor. These are the many banks that do banking not only for members but also for off-site parties. And they do that as part of a business operation where they are basically acting kind of like a banker, and they get a banker's fee for that. So overall, big picture, this really got going in the early to mid-90s. And what this graph shows you is, again, you can see the dry years like we had in our water market graphs. And here the orange are millions of acre-feet stored in Kern County by these banks. And the the dark green, I guess, is some special groundwater banking storage that was done in Southern California by the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, which is a large wholesaler there. And they do some of that storage within their service area in adjudicated basins and special districts, and they also do some outside in some other Southern California management areas. Now, what's interesting about this map, this graph, you can see that the storage levels are going up, 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 flattened out here because definitely they weren't putting more water in, and in some cases you had people taking some water out. And then we go up again as people are storing more water in there. And then here comes the drought from 2007 to 2009, and we see that the levels are going way down. And then back up again. This turned out, 2011, to be a really wet year, so they were extremely lucky, especially in Kern County. They were pretty much able to get back up in the aggregate to the amount stored before the drought. If you add up the amount that they took out in each year during this drought, we find it's nearly 2 million acre feet, 1.9 million acre feet, and that's 3 times more than what the water market made available in special dry year supplies. So this has been an extremely valuable tool during that most recent drought. They were able to rapidly recharge. That was lucky, thanks to a big wet year where there were no constraints really on delta pumping, and so a lot of water could come down and go into those banks. But you did also see some conflicts arising in Kern County over the falling groundwater tables and concerns about whether the banks were causing some injury to local groundwater pumpers. So, implications for policy and sort of what does this mean in the context of the current drought? First, I'll say that it's been so dry this year that there were some real concerns about whether there was going to be much of a water market anyway. And the governor's emergency declaration from back in January definitely did emphasize the idea of expediting water transfers as an important action, but until people kind of knew what the water year was going to be like, there was a lot of reticence to even, for folks who potentially would be selling in a typical dry year, they weren't sure whether they were going to have water to be able to sell. Now that we did get some rains, you've seen some transfer arrangements happening and a lot of effort to try to make that happen more quickly. You definitely also have seen the groundwater banks activated, but we're also seeing some of the constraints come into play as well. And I just want to highlight for you the things that we concluded from our study in late 2012. I think a lot of these are still relevant to think about. So one is we need to address infrastructure gaps, and this includes the big thing, which is the delta, but also there are some other ways in which we need to think about, are there smaller solutions, smaller scale solutions in terms of improving conveyance, improving the flexibility of the system and the ability for people to use facilities differently that could help. We're seeing this a bit now with the Department of Water Resources and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation making it possible to use existing conveyance facilities for water we wouldn't normally put in there, like allowing people to put groundwater in there within the San Joaquin Valley to move it to other parts of the region. Second point is making the institutional review process more consistent and transparent and predictable. And I think that there's some progress happening here, but there's still a feeling that a lot more could be done to make this something that we can really tee up and get going quickly in an emergency, as well as for long-term transfers that really need to be thought out well in advance. Strengthening local groundwater management is a key thing, both for facilitating water marketing and for especially for groundwater banking, because if you don't have a strong management system locally, you basically can't do the accounting that you need to run a bank. Developing models to mitigate local economic impacts. This is, as I mentioned, a concern in the source regions, and there are some good models that are being tried in Southern California on the Colorado River system with where there are some large-scale fallowing operations in order to make water available for urban areas in Southern California. And part of that deal has involved putting together a fund in order to help support local economic development and mitigate harmful impacts. And then we suggested this last point, which is engaging high-level leaders who can take needed risks and break through barriers, that these are all the kinds of things that are not going to happen unless there's really the attention of people from the top, both at the state and at the federal level. Where we've seen big breakthroughs in our water market and in groundwater banking have often been thanks to folks at the top making it possible for things to happen. A lot of the innovation will happen at the local level, but the locals need the rules to be set up in a way that they're not restricted overly by the rules. And then I guess, thinking about the current drought and where it's having us especially focus attention in some of the promising areas, I mentioned that I think we are seeing some streamlining in institutional review process, which is good. I think that's going to have to be a continued conversation going on to next year and beyond, even if we're not in dry times, hopefully not in dry times next year. And then the second and really big area of progress I think that we are potentially seeing this year is in local groundwater management, where there's a lot of attention both by the administration and really grassroots efforts on the part of water agencies to think about how to improve the options for groundwater management at the local level in the places outside of our urbanized areas that already have formal management systems, so that folks can really use the groundwater basins as drought storage. We've got a lot of overdraft in many of these areas now. We've basically used too much water in the normal years and don't store enough in the wet times, and that's leading us to find that the dry times when we'd like to have more groundwater available, we don't. And so I think this is a really bright spot, maybe the silver lining of this drought. And I'm just going to close by showing you where you can find more information. This is the report called California's Water Market by the Numbers, Update 2012, and you can find it at the PPIC website, www.ppic.org. Thank you very much.